Imagine you have been assigned a very difficult project. And imagine that you and your team spend nearly 3 months analyzing data, designing a solution, and rationalizing potential results. And now you are making your project authorization and funding request presentation. But then the unbelievable happens. No one agrees with you. After all the months of preparing, all the months of analyzing, all the months of rationalizing, you present your final case to your constituents, to the stakeholders in your organization, and no one agrees with you. What do you do now? Hello and welcome to another MEI Beyond the Basics series e-learning program. My name is Alan Dunn. I am president of GDI Consulting and Training Company and the founder of the Manufacturing Executive Institute. Our program is an important one. It's about the essential mental models for continuous improvement project managers. What do you do when the rulebook runs out? How do you proceed on your continuous improvement projects when there's no rule book to guide you? This is a very important topic, especially for those in the lean continuous improvement world. It's important for at least two big reasons. The first is that in global supply chain management, and indeed in global business in general, this rule book that we operate with seems to run out, seems to continually run out. Every day there seems to be a problem that we haven't dealt with before. And the second really important reason is that models and processes and methodologies designed to guide us to solutions are now far more important than ever before. We need the logic of models to really help us move forward in our continuous improvement projects. Our training mission today is to provide some tangible solutions to these problems. Now, I warn you that this program is not about change management theory. Oh, sure, we're going to talk about a little bit of theory. We're going to talk about how to create a shared need, and we're going to talk about mobilizing people and mobilizing commitments and monitoring projects. But really, it's far more than that. What we're going to try to talk about is about the impediments, the things that get in the way of moving your continuous improvement projects forward. Now, CI continuous improvement, or CI projects, I should say, often will be contextual. They can only really be solved with three important things. One is domain knowledge. You have to know a lot about the domain as a project manager. Two is broad experience. You need more experience than just in the area that the CI project focuses on. You need to know the inputs and you need to know the outputs. You need to know the context of what you're working on and what you're trying to fix. And then lastly, you need mental models and you need methodologies to help you along the way. Mental models are a new mandate in a global business world where this rule book runs out. And again, almost every day. Now, I've said this already a couple times, but you understand that there are guidelines, there are policies, there are procedures in organizations. But as we've globalized our supply chains and as we've globalized our businesses, a lot of those rules just don't work anymore. And so we have to come up with new rules. But instead of coming up with a plethora of rules, we need to be thinking about how to come up with guidelines, how to come up with logic, how to come up with mental models. Now, a mental model is a mind construct that you use to guide your reasoning when trying to understand something about your surrounding environment. Mental models help to shape your thinking processes and even your behaviors. Mental models provide a cognitive framework for solving problems, kind of your own mental Swiss Army knife that can be pulled from the recesses of your mind when a confusing situation needs to be understood or a problem needs to be solved, a problem perhaps that's never existed before. Mental models are literal, image-centric explanations in your brain that seek to describe how something works in your world. You can actually call these up from your neural video server when you need them. Mental models help you to understand life around you. Mental models guide your perception and your behaviors. Mental models are logical, but rarely factual. Mental models help you with the logic of what's going on and let the facts step aside for a second. Mental models are very logical. Mental models are imperfect, though, but they're still useful. And mental models work, at least the best ones are the ones that provide the most utility. Charlie Munger, who is Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway's, arguably one of the most successful investment banking companies in the history of the world, has said that 80 or 90 important models will carry about 90% of the freight in making you a worldly wise person. And of those, only a mere handful really carry heavy freight. What he's talking about is Pareto's law, that 20% of your problems cause 80% of your headaches. 20% of your thinking can be used if it's structured in mental models and structured with logic to help you solve problems perhaps that you've never experienced before. Now, in this presentation, I want to share with you 3 mental models that every continuous improvement project leader should have, that everyone should think about. I also want to share with you some methodologies to convert at least a couple of those mental models into useful diagnostic and analytic instruments. And so these are for every single CI project manager. The first one that we're going to talk about is the Impediments Decomposition model. This is a mental model that helps you to decompose problems into understanding the 4 levels of impediments. Then we're going to move on to the Constituents of Change mental model. This is a mental model that helps you to understand who's going to be involved in the change that you're trying to put forth in your organization through your CI project. We're going to convert that into an actual diagnostic instrument, which we refer to as the 2 squared, 4 squared change priorities methodology. We use the phrase bolt-on methodology because this is a natural methodology that works with this Constituents of Change model. The third and final mental model will be the reactions to change model, which is a model that describes how people behave, particularly when there's a change. And we're going to have another bolt-on methodology, which we call the facts plus mobilization methodology. So that's kind of a quick overview. Let's get into the first mental model. Mental model number 1, the Impediments Decomposition model. I love this illustration because this is what life feels like. To any CI project manager, life feels like a series of speed bumps, one after the other. None are so significant that they stop the progress, but they all tend to slow the progress of the projects down. And so this decomposition model, or this impediments decomposition model, suggests that every problem you have facing you as a CI project manager has 4 categories of impediments: technical impediments, organizational impediments, cultural impediments, and behavioral impediments. Now, this Venn diagram is important. It overlaps because well, the lines are a little bit murky. They are a little bit confusing. Nevertheless, it's still a useful model in order to help you break down these problems that you have when you're implementing company or corporate changing sort of projects. Continuous improvement projects run the gamut, as you know, from minor improvement programs to huge corporate shaping sort of programs. Doesn't make any difference what level the CI project is at. Every one of them, mark my word, every project you have has technical, organizational, cultural, and behavioral impediments, or at least elements to the solution. Let's drill down and talk about the first one. Hardware, software, equipment, applications, technical enablers, procedures, work instructions, and all other technology methodologies and process-centric enablers make up the technical impediment side of this mental model. These are needed to operate an organizational entity and even an entire organization. So the technical impediments are the things that can usually be solved with money, time, and some innovative thinking. On the other hand, organizational impediments are those organization structures, workflows, talent selection, talent development, talent management, talent retention, work content design, and all other organizational and people-centric enablers necessary to manage and lead the people side of your business. I would challenge you to think about all your CI projects and to think about problems you had with certain departments, certain functions, certain organizational entities. That's what we're talking about here. Organizational impediments to getting a new continuous improvement project implemented. The third one is our cultural impediments. Cultural impediments include collective beliefs, values, behaviors that determine how employees and management interact with each other and how they manage the outside business transactions. Culture is implied, not expressly defined, and develops organically over time from cumulative traits of people that your company has hired. A company's culture is often reflected in its dress codes, its business hours, its office setup and design, its employee benefits, its turnover, its hiring decisions, employee retention programs, communication protocols, how it treats its customers, its actual customer satisfaction, and every other aspect of operating the enterprise. It's hard to describe a culture, but we all know a good one when we see one, and we all know a bad one when we see one. Behavioral impediments on your CI projects are probably the most difficult to deal with. This is about people, not collective people, but individual people. This is about the way an individual addresses situations single-handedly or in a group, and how they're influenced by other kinds of factors and what those factors are. Individual behavior is defined as a mix of responses to external and internal stimuli. It's the way a person fits into an organization and reacts in different situations, and the way someone expresses different emotions like anger and happiness, cooperation, empathy, sympathy, affection, etc. The key factors that influence an individual's behavior in personal, social, and work life typically are broken into inherited characteristics and learned characteristics. Those inherited characteristics are features that the individual acquires from the parents or from their forefathers, or they're just inherited genetically. The learned characteristics are those characteristics and behaviors that are developed from interactions at home and school and societal institutions, which includes prior employers. And by the way, the current employer as well. Characteristics of an individual are those that are developed by how they observe and how they practice learning throughout their life. There are plenty, of course, other factors that affect and impact behavior, including abilities and experience, gender, race, cultures, attribution, and perceptions, and attitudes, and things like that. So you can see why behavioral impediments are so important. It's important to understand that a lot of times people don't want to do things because of some prior baggage of them to them individually. And as a CI project manager, you need to understand that every person is not a rational person. We're going to talk more about rational thinking later. And that there's other reasons why people push back on projects other than they don't agree with the rational outcomes. And so behavioral tends to be very, very difficult. So I want to give you a little pop quiz here relating to the impediments decomposition model. What impediment do you think is the easiest to overcome? If you said technical, you would be correct. And the reason that technical impediments are easy to overcome is because, as I said earlier, it's always just about money and time and some innovation. Now, the innovation is the hardest part of that, for sure. People think that we can't change because we don't have the money to invest in new processes or procedures. Well, at the end of the day, continuous improvement changes are all about adding value to the organization, mostly economic value. Generally, the money isn't the issue. The capital isn't the issue. It's usually the innovation and the available time. The second question is, what category of impediments do most CI project managers mostly focus? And the answer, if you said technical, would be again correct. It's the correct answer, but it's the wrong thing to do. So as a continuous improvement project manager, your job is to make change in organizations, to move it from an as-is to a to-be world, to move it from an old operating paradigm to a new operating paradigm. And the problem is you can't do that just by investing technically. Now, I grew up in my business and my consulting career in the 1980s. In 1980 to 1994, I ran a consulting firm that did nothing but ERP system implementations. And I can tell you that buying the software was the easiest thing to do. Determining which software to use was the easiest thing. The software's technical skill sets and capabilities were a no-brainer. It was, how do I train people to think differently, to act differently, to work differently? Those were the real challenges. Third question is, what category of impediments really drive implementation success? If you said organizational, cultural, and behavioral, you would be correct. So here's the question that's not on the slide, and that is, why do so many continuous improvement project managers focus on the technical when we all know that the organizational, cultural, and behavioral changes that have to be made are the key drivers and the key success factors of CI project success? I want you to never forget this 4-bubble Venn diagram. So I want you to think about this mnemonic to kind of index your brain. We call it the talk and be. Internally, we always refer to this as the talk and be model. The technical, the organizational, the cultural, and the behavioral, the TOC and B, the talk and be mnemonic. I want you to think about that as we move to our first moment of wisdom. Sustainable, continuous improvement solutions can only be achieved by successfully addressing all 4 elements in this model. You cannot just address the technical. You must address the organizational, cultural, and behavioral elements of your project as well. And you must operationalize those as well. And we're going to talk about how to do that. It is worth mentioning that there's a special and deadly type of impediment. It's called the legacy investments impediment. Legacy investments can be one of 3 or all of 3. It can be capital investments. You've invested in factories that are now obsolete, but nobody wants to admit it. You've invested in mindsets, a way of thinking, and nobody wants to change. And you've invested in a strategy that doesn't work anymore. And yet nobody wants to move beyond that. I'll give you some examples. Let's talk about Kodak. Kodak had a strategy around film. That was an interesting strategy and a very successful strategy. In fact, an amazingly successful strategy for a lot of years. SkyTel was the first global digital pager. So not only do you get a page, you get a beep by wearing this thing on your belt, but you also could see the message from somebody. It could translate somebody's voicemail message into a digital message. It was a very interesting device in the 1980s and 90s. BlackBerry. Don't we all love BlackBerry? BlackBerry fundamentally invented the smartphone business. BlackBerry invented a lot of data encryption to make them very useful. And who growing up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s didn't love Polaroid? Polaroid is a spectacular company. Was a spectacular company. Invented the instant film business. And of course, in the 80s and late into the 90s, everybody loved Blockbuster Video. Blockbuster Video at one time was the most powerful entity in the entertainment industry. Movies didn't get made unless Blockbuster reviewed the scripts and deemed them rentable after they went through their tour of theaters. But what happened? Well, companies like Lexmark and several others created wonderful color printers, inexpensive printers that took over the instant film business. Apple, of course, with the iPhone, killed the BlackBerry. Verizon Wireless grew up and became the first major wireless carrier. It was called Pactel Cellular when it was created. SkyTel could have been the Verizon Wireless. And of course, Blockbuster Video saw the streaming business. There's some great case studies on this. They saw the streaming business. They knew the streaming business was going to deal a blow to their business, but they wouldn't move beyond the bricks and mortar stores. And of course, they're virtually out of business. And then, of course, Kodak, who invented the digital camera for the most part. They lost that whole digital world to Nikon and Canon. And of course, at the same time, they lost the film business. And so these are great examples of legacy investments, capital investments, mindset investments, and strategy investments that management and leaders would not give up. So this leads us to a moment of wisdom. Legacy capital, mindset, and strategic investments are every CI project manager's worst nightmare. Overcoming these seemingly permanent investments will require every available organizational, cultural, and behavioral change management tool. Notice I didn't include technical, because these are the kinds of changes to get rid of legacy investments, to get rid of film production factories, and instead invest in digital streaming. These are the kinds of paradigm shift sort of investments that required nothing but organizational, cultural, and behavioral skill sets. The technical is known, it's just not admitted to. So let's move to mental model number 2, the constituents of change model. So the constituents of change model is a real interesting model. I have used this model for my entire adult life. Every time I have a project, a consulting project with a client, I break down the population of people that I have to work with into the analysts. I'm usually one of them, the people who actually come up with the go forward. This is part of lean manufacturing. Somebody takes an as-is, designs a to-be process, and those are what we're going to call the analysts. And then there's the participants, the people who are going to actually do the work, do the heavy lifting to implement. And then there's the impactants. Now, don't look that word up in the dictionary. It doesn't exist. I made that word up. The impactants are the individuals who are going to be impacted. And they're mostly inside our company, but they could be outside the company as well. And then there's the leaders and champions. These are the people who run the business and are championing or at least sponsoring your CI projects. What I want to do is I want to try to deal with these in a little bit more detail. So the analysts are the individuals who kind of study a process. They define the as-is process and flows. They develop alternatives. They determine the best holistic solutions from a number of alternative solutions. They design the new to-be processes, and they rationalize the newly engineered solutions, both in terms of productivity and economic terms. Now, they could also rationalize it in terms of safety and competitiveness and dominance and things like that. Analysts believe in a solution because they have methodically approached the problem with rational and hopefully unbiased thinking. Let's take a look at the participants. Participants are the individuals believed to be the implementers of whatever change comes forward from the CI projects. Because they will execute most implementation activities defined by the analysts, they tend to take the change a bit more seriously and generally more skeptical of the proposed levels of efforts, costs, and benefits. So if participants are not in agreement with the proposed change, progressing on implementing the change will at best be risky, and most likely it will fail. The impactants, the word that I created. Impactants are those individuals who are predicted to be impacted by the proposed change. Relative to other constituents, this is always the largest and the most diverse group of people. As a class, impactants usually have less consensus about the magnitude of the proposed efforts, costs, and benefits that are proposed and derived from the successful implementation of the change. So, in other words, impactants, because it's a broader base of individuals and a larger base of individuals, they tend to have less consensus about the benefits, the cost, and the purpose of the change. Now, leaders and champions are a unique group. Leaders and champions are a very small group of individuals who work in leadership roles and are possibly champions of the proposed change, or the desired result, perhaps, of the proposed change. Because of their position and authorities within an organization, individuals in this group can, by simple errant comments, breathe additional life into a CI initiative, or they can kill it. Leaders and champions' comments about project or improvement initiatives, viability, efforts, cost, or benefits uttered at the water cooler or in the kitchen can easily alter others' perspectives and even support or lack of support of the proposed change. So this leads us to an interesting moment of wisdom. As your experiences in CI projects increase, you will discover the least important stakeholder in terms of successful project completion is actually you, the project leader, most likely the analyst. It doesn't really matter what you think. It matters what the participants, the impactants, the leaders and champions think. In fact, it only matters what they think. The first mental model had us take a look at the technical, organizational, cultural, and behavioral impediments to success in your project. This mental model suggests that there are different types of individuals, the analysts, the participants, the impactants, and the leaders and champions, whom you have to approach differently. And you have to know who they are. You can't guess who they are. You have to know who they are. So I'm going to share with you a tool that's built on the Constituents of Change model. It's called the 2 squared, 4 squared change priorities matrix or change priorities model. I have not done a project in more than 25 years. I have not done a single consulting project in more than 25 years. Little ones all the way to major Fortune 500 transformational projects. I have not done one of them where I haven't used this change priorities tool. This has helped me to really understand of the multiple initiatives that come out of any transformation or any continuous improvement project, which ones should be worked on and which ones should not be worked on. I want you to imagine for a moment that you have 5 CI initiatives that come out of one of your as-is to-be sort of analysis, but you only have enough resources to implement perhaps 2 of those. And this becomes a little bit problematic because you want to do all 5, but you don't have the money or the time or the people to do all of it. Plus, you need to understand that you're not going to do them all at the same time. You're not going to do 5 simultaneous implementations of 5 different improvement initiatives. So you're going to have to pick, and you're going to at least have to sequence them. And so do you go after the ones that are an easy win to create momentum? That's the momentum school of change management. Or do you go after the ones that have the big payback? That's called the economic school of CI initiatives. So we have to try to figure this out. So we're going to figure this out with a tool called the 2 squared, 4 squared change priorities model or matrix. This is a tool for understanding 3 different trade-offs: behavioral trade-offs, economic trade-offs, and organizational trade-offs for any initiative. So each one of those 5 initiatives, we're going to look at the behavioral, the economic, and the organizational trade-offs. It's also a tool to understand 2 different kinds of agendas. Individuals, that is, right down to individual people with first name, middle initials, and last names, or collective agendas, what groups of people think. And then we're going to use this as a tool to understand consensus and diversity of opinion. So we're going to look at both the magnitude and the range of opinions, particularly opinions about the CI initiative that you're putting forth. At the end of the day, what we're trying to understand is all the people that are going to be involved, particularly the participants, impactants, and leaders and champions, how engaged are they, or how willing are they to be engaged in the implementation? How much do they trust one another and trust the organization will allow them to be successful? And what's, at the end of the day, the economic payback? When a number of continuous improvement projects compete for resources, we believe it's the 2 squared, 4 squared change priorities model that will clarify the priorities. Now, let me show you how we're going to do this. And this is really kind of an important logic. So we're going to take 4 groups of people. We already talked about them: analysts, participants, impactants, and leaders and champions. And we're going to ask each of them, each participant in each of those groups. So we're going to talk to people as well as groups, and we're going to ask them 4 questions, just 4 questions, 4 perfectly sequenced questions. And the sequence of the questions is just as important as the questions. And then we're going to plot their answers in a 2x2 matrix. The idea is that we're going to seek to evaluate the projects before approval. We're going to evaluate these projects even before we seek approval. We're not even going to seek approval for the ones that don't come out in the right quadrant of the matrix. So what we're looking for is level of engagement of individuals, particularly participants and impactants and leaders and champions. We're looking for a level of trust in the organization around that particular project, and then we're looking for the economic value derived from successful implementation. So if you look at the matrix, I just put on the left side, on the left axis, a header on there that talks about the personal willingness to participate in the CI project implementation, from top to bottom, high to low. And then on the bottom, I'm going to put an axis of the perceived potential for implementation success. What we're really asking there is, how much do you trust the organization? How much do you trust your colleagues? But we can't ask that because you'd get a biased answer. So instead, we just ask this question about the perceived potential for implementation success. And you'll see the actual question in just a minute. Those are what we refer to as the behavioral insights. So we're going to ask the analysts and the participants and the leaders and champions and impactants, we're going to ask them all their opinion of a given project. Now, this is after we deliver a project theme descriptor or a project charter or an A3. Any one of those tools will work. We're then going to also ask, after those first two behavioral questions, we're going to ask them about what they perceive as the real economic benefit. Irrespective of what's proposed, we want them to give us their opinion of, in terms of magnitude from high to low, top to bottom there, what they think about the proposed benefits. And then we want to encourage them to give us their insights on the perceived magnitude of costs to achieve the proposed benefits. In other words, the top axis is about cost, the right axis is about benefits, or payback, if you will. Those are what we refer to as the economic insights. And that top quadrant, obviously the top right quadrant, we refer to that as quadrant 3. Starting from the bottom, the red, quadrant 1, working clockwise, 2 is the top yellow one, 3 is the green one, and 4 is the bottom yellow one. If you think about that top green quadrant, that means that the people that score in there are highly engaged, trust one another, and the project is high benefit, low cost, which means it's high value. On the other hand, if the project scores in the bottom left-hand, or quadrant number 1, then that means people aren't willing to participate for the most part. There's low trust, and there's not a whole lot of value. So it turns out it's low benefits, and it's probably high cost, so very low value. And if you take a look at quadrant number 2, the top yellow quadrant, that's where people are all excited, and they're very engaged, but they don't trust one another. And there's not a lot of value there because it's a high benefit, but it's also a high cost. And then the bottom yellow, that's a low engagement, high trust, low value quadrant. What I'm going to suggest to you is that the projects of the 5 CI projects that I talked about earlier, you would do an analysis of each one of those projects. You would apply this model to each one of the 5 projects, and the project scores have to mostly be in the green area. If they're in the green area, then it's probably a go. If it's in the red area, it's a definite no-go. So let me suggest an example here. So again, I have my groups of people. I have my analysts, my participants, my impactants, and leaders and champions. I have my 5 projects that we talked about earlier. And now I'm going to take a look at just project number 2. And I'm going to eventually do this for all 5 of the projects. But for project number 2, I identify that there's 2 of us on the project team that put together the project theme descriptor, the project charter, or the A3. So there's 2 of us analysts. We've identified 9 people by name, first name, middle initial, last name. Groups and titles don't work here. We have to use people's names. We have to become intimate with who's going to be involved. So we identified 9 people who are going to actually be involved in the implementation. We identified 21 people, and by the way, usually it's more like a factor of 100 times, not 2 times here. But for teaching purposes, you'll see why in a minute, why I only used the 21. So 21 impactants, 21 people we believe are going to be impacted, and then there's 4 leaders and champions that are going to be involved. The methodology suggests that we're going to get them in a room. I'm going to get, say, the participants in a room, and I'm going to ask them this question. I'm not going to let them take this home and vote. I'm not going to let them get together and have groups decide how they should answer in order to get the capital budgets that they want. Instead, I'm going to do it in a workshop setting. And after we go through the A3 with them or the project charter with them, we're going to ask this first question for everybody in the room, all you participants in the room. How willing are you to personally participate in the improvement project as described? 1 is little, 10 is a lot, and they have to individually score that. Each person has this ballot in front of them, and they have to score it. When they're done scoring that, then we ask them, what is your perception of the organization's ability to implement the proposed change as described? Again, 1 to 10. Now, if they answer 2, what that means is that they believe they can do the work, but that it won't be successful. So that's why this is kind of a referendum on their perception of trust. And so this individual answers 6, so just, kind of a little bit above average. Then we ask the third question. We're now to the economic insights. The first 2 were the behavioral insights. What is your perception of the magnitude of benefits if the implementation of the proposed change is successful? And they score this, and they say huge benefits. And then we ask them, what is your perception of the magnitude of costs if the implementation of the proposed change is successful? And they answer this one, and they think the costs are going to be kind of high. So there's 1 to 10 is low cost to high costs. We even might suggest you color code the ballots so you can have all the participants in the room at one time, or you can mix them. Just make sure everybody has the right color code. So we had the color for analysts, then we had those for participants, and then we had those for impactants and those for leaders and champions. The ballot I'm showing you is the actual ballot. That's not just a teaching ballot. That's what the actual ballot looks like, and that's how they score it based on the presentation for each project charter. And so if I take that now and I start to plot the data, so I get all those ballots back, and I have ballots from 2 different analysts, and so I plot the behavioral insights, notice that both of them on the left axis, both of them are at the high end of willing to participate, and they're both better than average in their belief of successful implementation. The closeness of the 2 horizontal lines and the closeness of the 2 vertical lines indicate level of consensus. We then ask them about their perception of benefits and costs. And you can see, again, they're up in the top quadrant or quadrant 3. And then we color code all that together just to kind of create a visual image that suggests that if it was up to the analysts, we would do this project. But it's not up to the analysts. Let's go to the participants now. There's 9 of them. And so the 9 of them all answer on the behavioral questions. They all answer on those round dots. And notice the bandwidth between the 2 horizontal lines and also the 2 vertical lines. You can see there's far less consensus. There's a greater diversity of opinion here. Now, here's something that we do very interesting with multiple participants. You don't do it when you just have 2 analysts, but you would do it when you have this many other respondents. So we draw a regression line, a mathematical regression line, and then we go out about 1.15 standard deviations from that, each side. That represents about 75% of the population of respondents. And we do that just to get a sense, to get a visual sense of where the respondents lie. And you can see there's 1-2 outliers there, but most of them lie within that 75% bandwidth. We then ask them the economic questions, and notice the economic questions all score over on the left side there. And we do the same thing there. We draw the regression line, 1.15 standard deviations, and then we color the whole area in. By the way, that's not statistically sound. It's graphically sound, but it's not statistically sound. But we do it to get a view of that particular project. What this says is that behaviorally, the participants really like this project, but if you really get to the data elements, they like the benefits, but they think it's going to be more costly than was proposed. That's really good information, because the people who are actually going to do the work, actually going to participate in the work, actually think it's going to be more costly. So we're done with the participants. Now let's go to the 21 impactants. 21 impactants. You can see the space between the vertical and the horizontal lines suggests a lot less consensus. You would expect that from a larger group of individuals. We draw the regression line, and we have a couple outliers, as you can see, or several outliers, as you can see. We do the 1.15 or the 75% bandwidth. We then look at the economic insights. By the way, notice those are all generally up in the quadrant 3. We do the same thing, the regression line. The fact that these cross means nothing. It's just the way the graphics work. And then we color code all of that, and we can see that generally, with the exception of a few outliers, the impactants think this is a pretty good project. The people going to be impacted think it's a pretty good project. But we're not done. We have the leaders and champions. So the first thing we do is we have the leaders and champions answer the 2 behavioral questions. Notice that they're not willing to participate, and they think that the organization will fail. Wow. Think about what that says. And by the way, pretty tight consensus of those 4 as well. Individually as well as collectively, they generally believe that this project will fail. But when we asked them the economic questions, the perceived benefits and the perceived costs, they see it as a low cost and a high benefit. Wow, they think economically this is a great project, but they don't trust their own people. You color between all those lines and you get a space that looks like that. That lower tail really bothers me. It really bothers me a lot. I want you to think about what this really means. This means that the leaders and champions, while they like the project, they don't believe their people can be successful. For whatever reason, they don't believe that. So when I build a composite of all of this, you can see the analysts generally are in quadrant number 3. You can see the participants are in quadrant number 3 and 2. And the only reason they're in 2 is because they think the costs are going to be higher than was proposed. If you look at the impactants, they're mostly in quadrant number 3. And then you look at the leaders and champions. And by understanding and decomposing the behavioral from the economic insights, you see that. So the question is, when we have something like this, we look at it and ask the question, what would you do with this CI project? Now, this is an actual tool, came from an actual project a number of years ago that we turned down. Our consulting firm turned this one down. And the reason we would not do this project is because we said it's too early, or it's not the right time, or there's some prerequisites that the leaders have to do. We said we're not going to touch a project that everybody feels good about, but the leaders and champions. Remember, these are the individuals who at the water cooler can say something that deep sixes our project or deep sixes our initiative. And so we decided not to do that. So my counsel to you is you just can't look at the aggregate. You have to look at the individual pieces of this methodology, and then you can learn a lot from that. So we had this same particular one existed on a project where we had a number of initiatives that we were going to implement on a major transformation. And so one looked much like what you see on the left-hand side. Another project looked like what they had in the middle, and then the other one looked like on the right side. The question is, which one would you do? Which one would you invest in? Well, clearly you would invest in that one on the left. You would invest there because most of the analysts, participants, leaders and champions, and participants believe that this is a high value, and it's a high trust, and it's a high engagement sort of a project. You know, when we take a look at all the different possible interpretations, one interpretation is the quadrant 3. We call that the just do it quadrant. On the flip side, quadrant 1, we call that the run like the wind quadrant, because of all the projects we've seen that have scored there, but the client still wants to do them, 100% of them have failed. Not most of them, not some of them, but all of them have failed. Then you get some other bipolar sort of failures. This is a certain failure because this one goes across a number of quadrants or 2 quadrants. And so there's no consensus on willingness, low on organizational trust, and no consensus on benefits and pretty high costs. Another bipolar distribution that we've seen looks like this: no consensus on willingness, no consensus on organizational trust, no consensus on benefits, and no. So this is kind of the no consensus sort of evaluation, and that's likely a failure for sure. And then we have the bipolar the other way, pretty much the same thing. And then we have this one, which we've never actually have seen. This is where it goes across all four quadrants, all the points. And our assumption is if we get one of these back as a result of the ballots and the survey, then it probably means we did a bad job of describing the project. It's probably a faulty A3 or project theme descriptor or project charter. Everything else is going to be in those yellow zones. And so you start to see that all of those are risky or ho-hum or kind of inconclusive. Generally what you're looking for is the quadrant number 3 or mostly in quadrant number 3. I might move to a risky one, but here's the point. I will do anything in or about 3 before I'll do a project that's in or about quadrant number 1. So sometimes you have to use a little common sense. So another moment of wisdom. The 2 squared, 4 squared change priorities bolt-on methodology eliminates pet CI projects, poorly designed CI projects, and projects that are doomed from the beginning from being pursued at all. Use this methodology to eliminate behavior-driven surprises. This is an absolute staple in my business. Over the last 40 years, I've worked on quite a number of corporate transformational projects. And every one of those, we've used this or a variation of this. Don't lose this methodology. If you want to know more about it, give us a call. We'll walk you through it one more time if we need to. So let's move on to mental model number 3, which is a real fun model. You're going to enjoy this. This is the reactions to change model. This is about how people react to change. Now, kind of the traditional view of reactions to change is illustrated on this chart provided to me by a colleague in Europe. On the left-hand side, we talk about the motivation and kind of the performance related to the project and over time. And so, projects, when you present them, typically go from denial to realization we need to do something, to anger, to letting go, searching. Eventually, you get up to where they want to actually do the project. But people being people have to kind of go through this. So this reactions to change model is really all about the people side of the project now. So in the reactions to change model, there's an assumption that people will react to change one of 3 ways. They will react rationally, which doesn't happen all that often. They will react emotionally, or they will react politically. And so again, we have to segment our individuals, our leaders and champions, our participants, our impactants. We need to segment those into who's likely, who gives the cues that they're going to react rationally, and who gives the cues that they're going to react emotionally, and who gives the cues to us that they're going to react politically, because each of those are going to require a different way of presenting the project or presenting the initiative. Present an initiative to an emotional reactor in a rational way, they're not going to hear you. And so this is a very valuable methodology. It's a model that's useful for us when we're starting to put together these CI implementations. Let's talk a little bit about the very first, the rational. Rational reactions to change within a business enterprise happen when people are primarily moved to action and or acceptance by facts, analysis, and compelling dialogue. If it makes rational sense, these reactors are all for the proposed change. You will discover that in any change you make, this is the smallest group of individuals. These are the people who, even when you say their department needs to be eliminated, they understand the rationale behind that and they accept that. So these are very few and far between, but they do exist. An emotional reaction to change within a business enterprise happens when people are fearful of how the proposed change can impact their security or the security of other employees that they like. If it makes rational sense and is not perceived, the word perceived is important, to impact their personal security or the security of people they like, these reactors are going to be all for the proposed change. if it's not perceived to impact the security of the people they like, and it makes rational sense, then they'll probably go for it. The political reaction to change is the most difficult to deal with within a business enterprise. This happens when people are fearful of how the proposed change can impact their power, their turf, their influence, and even their authorities, or that of employees that they like. If it makes rational sense and is not perceived to impact their personal power, turf, and influence or authorities, then these reactors will go for this. So what's really important here is that you understand who the rational reactors are before you make your presentation. Before you get out there and make your presentation, you know who the rational reactors are by name, first name, middle initial, last name. You know who the emotional reactors are, and you know who the political reactors are. And then you can persuade them in what we refer to as their CRL, or their change reaction language. Change reaction language is an important language. You know, the way you make your presentation should be driven by the participants of the proposed change, not the change agent. So back to the participants and perhaps even impactants, it should be in their language, in their terms, in words that they understand. Failure to properly identify a participant, an impacted leader, or champion, and their particular CRL will result in more than half of what you say not resonating, in fact, not even being heard. This kind of represents a kickstart to that traditional S-curve that we talk about. So change is accepted slowly, and then it picks up very quickly, and then it starts to slow down and level off. But that S-curve is meaningless if you can't get started. And so this is a way of getting started or killing a project as fast as possible. That leads us to another moment of wisdom. It is delusional to believe that any more than a slim minority of internal stakeholders will react primarily from a rational position. Get used to focusing most of your CI language efforts on addressing emotional, that is employment security, and political, that is power, turf, and influence, reactions to change. Your focus should not be on the rational. That's a matter of fact, that's a given. Your real focus should be on the emotional and the political. So let's build a tool. Let's build on this reaction to change model. Let's use a methodology that we created quite a number of years ago that has been flawless for us. It's called the facts and mobilization methodology. It's actually more of a model than a methodology, but you'll understand it as we go through it. So imagine that you have an improvement initiative and a proposed change. You've described it in your project documentation. You're all ready to go. You're ready to push this into the organization, and then people start pushing back. And this is back to where we started this program. What do you do now when they start pushing back? Well, I'm going to give you what I think is the world's most underrated secret to success, at least for project managers on CI projects. So let's imagine a CI project. We're going to put it in this what I call facts and mobilization methodology. So let's imagine it's broken into three major areas. The first is the time you do the as-is analysis, and then the time that you come up with alternative solutions and solutions design, and kind of the to-be process, and then the rationalization and solution selection, getting ready for the fourth, which is not on this chart, which is the implementation. So the first three elements of the four major elements would be on this. The fourth element is what we call results delivery. It's the actual implementation efforts. So let's take now, and over on the left side, put a header over there called the number of facts collected. And then we're going to have time at the bottom. So as you go through your project, here's what's going to happen. You're going to collect lots of facts in the as-is phase. You're actually going to not stop collecting facts. You're going to not stop analytics and diagnostic routines, even in the middle phase. And you may still be doing some right up to that last moment where you're all done, you know exactly what needs to be done. And notice how each individual fact has slightly less value than the preceding fact. In other words, there's a diminishing return on facts. And you think when you get out to that end result there, you present the case, and all you can present is the rational argument. because that's all you have. All you have is facts. Do you think if you get all this and pull everybody together, all the participants, all the impactants, all the leaders and champions, even other analysts, do you think you're going to bring them into a big conference room or a big meeting room and you're going to present how you went through this project, all the as-is analysis you did, all the to-be analysis you did, and then the final project, and you think they're all going to clap and go, yeah, let's do it? The answer is no, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it because everybody in that room doesn't react rationally. And by the way, if it's a small group of people and they all say do it, then, well, count your blessings or wonder if they're not really with you. It's really important to understand that facts don't tell the full story here on project implementations. And here's the reason why. Notice over on the right side, I'm going to add another header over there on that axis. This is the number of mobilization events. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a series of mobilization events. These are events that get people engaged. Every time I have a fact, I have a mobilization event. I gather facts. I do a flow chart. I have a process flow fair where I do a survey. I have an event to go over the survey results with people. I do some analytic. I send it out to everybody for comments. So for every fact, or at least for every group of facts, there should be some sort of mobilization event. In our transformation work, we do these big, giant process flow charts. Some of these are 40, 50 feet long. And then we have a brown paper fair where we get everybody together and they go through and they put Post-it notes on. This will work, this won't work, here's my idea, here's your idea. And they do a wonderful job of critiquing what we've seen through our analytic and diagnostic eyes. But notice how in a mobilization flow, every mobilization event is additive to the previous mobilization events. Whereas facts have a diminishing value, mobilization has an additive value. Now what's important is when you get up to this point and you're having that final presentation, you've already had dozens, maybe hundreds of presentations with individuals. And so at this point in time, as you're having the formal event, everybody in the room has already been through everything that you're going to present, because this is the point, the crescendo of where fact gathering and mobilization all comes together. Now, to do this, you need to understand, as you probably do, you need to understand that you should never present your final conclusions for the first time in a large meeting comprised of participants, impactants, leaders, and champions. It's hard work. You need to pre-present individually first to each participant, to each impactant, and to each leader and champion. I want you to understand that this is not easy, and this takes a lot of time, which takes us to a moment of wisdom. There is nothing efficient about changing humans' minds. Learn how to pre-present your CI ideas as you develop them, and learn how to place equal emphasis on facts and mobilization. Change management isn't an efficient process. Continuous improvement implementation is not an efficient process. Strike the need for efficiency out of your lexicon. Strike it out of your world. We're not going to change people by focusing on how to efficiently change them. We need to think about how to effectively change them, and pre-presents building that additive mobilization on top of the facts is the best possible way to do that. So let's summarize here a bit. I want to try to give you some sense of how we tie all this together, and then we'll wrap this up. The first mental model we used was the Impediments Decomposition model. That helped you to actually build an A3 or a project charter that addresses what technically has to change, what organizationally has to change, which culturally has to change, and what behaviorally has to change. And in fact, that's the way my A3s read. That's the way my project theme descriptors read in our company. we actually will decompose a problem and then decompose solutions into what technically has to happen, what organizationally has to happen, work content, organization changes, etc., what culturally has, mindset, collective mindsets, and behaviorally, who has to change their behaviors. Now we have the project theme descriptor that's done the right way. Now we have to start to socialize that, and we have to socialize it amongst the participants, the impactants, and the leaders and champions. And we do that with that bolt-on model called the 2 squared, 4 squared change priorities model. We socialize it really to figure out how implementable that change will be. And then from that, now we go to work on the presentation, to get the funding, to get the authorization, to get the go-ahead by understanding who's going to react rationally, emotionally, and politically, and building 3 different presentations as a result of building those individual presentations through the pre-presents, which we discovered through the facts plus mobilization methodology. So, when asking for permission to move forward on a continuous improvement project, you should probably follow these 8 steps. 1, assure that you can clearly define the problem that your improvement initiative is designed to solve. That's what your A3 document or project charter or project theme descriptor is all about. 2, assure that you know precisely the technical, the organizational, the cultural, and the behavioral impediments to successful implementation. Be clear when addressing these impediments and have a clear means to address each. Use the impediment decomposition mental model to guide you here. 3, understand precisely who the CI project implementation constituents or stakeholders are. Use the constituents change mental model to guide you there. Think about who the analysts, the participants, the impactants, and the leaders and champions are. 4, assure the priority of the proposed CI project relative to all other projects or all other initiatives. Use the 2 squared, 4 squared change priorities methodology to clarify the priorities. Clarify them for you as well as for everybody else. And by the way, do this both in aggregate terms and also for each constituent group in using the constituents of change model again. Step 5, assure that you understand precisely, and I mean precisely, I mean by person, first name, middle initial, last name, precisely who will react to the change that you're proposing in the rational, emotional, and political ways. Use the reactions to change mental model to guide you here. Step number 6, we're not done yet. Develop 3 different presentations and or A3 documents to sell the CI initiatives to those 3 different groups. Those who respond to change politically, emotionally, and rationally. One of the presentations primarily focuses on the rational view of the CI project. Another will focus on the emotional view, and a third will focus on the political view. They're still going to have the secondary description for all of those in rational terms, but the primary will be in emotional or political terms. Step 7, present each of these to the individuals in the respective stakeholder groups, and try to understand, again, how you segment this by political, emotional, and rational reactors. Make appropriate adjustments and then finalize the presentation to your decision-making body. Be sure everyone in the final approval meeting has already previously privately reviewed your approach, your document, and your methodologies, and conduct that really, really big meeting, which should be really nothing more than a formality. And I want you to remember this. Making big changes will never be efficient. It will never be an efficient process. Stop trying to make efficient changes and replace this approach with how to make effective changes. It will always take longer to get to yes, but it will eliminate most of the future second-guessing that politics so often creates and that so often destroys important initiatives before they can complete. Remember, There are no rewards for initiating a CI project that from the outset is doomed to fail. Pick your projects wisely and implement them with an eye always on long-term technical, organizational, cultural, and behavioral success. I want you to think about how all that ties together, and I want you to realize that this is how we go from knowledge, that is the A3, to actual successful application, better known as implementation. Thank you for attending another Beyond the Basics Series e-learning event. My name is Alan Dunn. This program has been sponsored by GDI Consulting and Training Company, developed by the Manufacturing Executive Institute, and produced by Radio MEI. To find additional relevant and useful e-learning programs, go to www.mfgexecutive.com. Now go and make a difference.